Today, we're joined again by Ron Pattinson, and this is Ron's second program with Gourmet Brewing, but it's our first one with him live from Amsterdam. I'm going to put a link in the chat there, and I hope you'll use that chat also. This was a link to Ron's previous webinar, and I think we had pretty good video then, so hopefully this one will pick back up. Ron's video, fortunately, seems to be working better than mine. Ron is a prolific writer, and he has dozens of books on beer history and beer recipes and recreations and beer styles. So, Ron, welcome again to Gourmet Brewing, and would you mind introducing today's topic?
We're going to be looking at the history of mild. So going from really when mild as a recognizable style begins, which is the early 19th century, up through until the 1980s, and seeing all the changes that mild went through over that period, which are pretty well amazingly huge. So it's probably one of the styles that's varied the most over time of any. So I'll go through the different phases of mild and how it was at various periods. And yeah, hopefully people will find it enjoying.
Great. Well, that sounds fantastic. And, you know, I've been looking forward to this since, what, July, Ron? Is that when we last talked? And I think someone in the chat encouraged us to do one on milds next. So,
okay, yeah, I'm glad people are interested. But I mean, maybe it's not such a, I think because it's not such a common style, often people are more interested in brewing it. I know personally from some of the people I know in home brew clubs around Washington, D.C., that quite a few of them brew milds, and the reason they brew them is they can't buy commercial ones. So it's the only way they can get to drink them. So I think that's why there's quite a lot of often more interest amongst home brewers in some of these styles than there is amongst the normal drinkers.
Well, I wish I had brewed mine because I wouldn't have had to look so hard for one. But first, let me go through a few housekeeping issues before we jump into Ron's program. If your webinar is not playing correctly, a lot of times if you'll refresh your browser window, that will correct most issues. If you can't hear, double check that you've unmuted or turned up your speakers. And I wanted to let you know we've got a couple of webinars coming up. I'm really looking forward to one October 10th with Ashton Lewis. That's Mr. Wizard for those of you here in the United States. Ashton Lewis has just returned from a week in Yakima, and he's going to be covering hop buying essentials. After that, we're going to be talking to Jennifer Pereira, and she's going to be talking on diacetyl. And after that, we've got Laura Ann Gotti, and this is going to be our first kind of collaboration with the HomebrewCon presentations and AHA. So a lot of exciting things coming up. Please ask your questions. Ron, I see there's already 3 questions. So
all right,
this is a great chance to get Ron to answer your questions. So I'd encourage you to type those in the Ask a Question box. And it looks like we got a ton of people. I see Mike and Alexander. Greetings from Chile and Gray Central, New York. All right. And then Mike Hoover is from famously hot South Carolina. And yes, Mike, I'll agree with you. It is real hot. Let me just remind you, don't put any questions in the chat screen because they'll probably get looked over. But I do encourage you to say where you're from, you know, share answers when we have questions, but just don't put your questions there and expect Ron to find them. These are part of a series of webinars I'm creating to help the study groups that I'm fostering. And if you're not a member yet and are interested in exploring the journey of becoming or advancing as a Cicerone or BJCP judge, I'd encourage you to search Facebook groups for BJCP 101, 201, or the Mead study groups. And be sure to answer all of the membership questions. We're picky because we want to protect you when you come into there. Also want to let you know this is a crowdsourced program. Everything that we are doing here is funded by Patreon members and others that want to see these programs go on. Ron and I are volunteering our time, but there are very real costs associated with the program. And so if you want to see them continue, please consider submitting and helping support these webinars. They're entirely crowdfunded. I also want to thank some people who have helped: Jane Price, Dave Marsh, for their recent financial support. My regular Patreon supporters: Andy Glidden, Brent Dingus, Omer Brashai, Clay Bunn, Dan Sakai, Gene Jockey, Jerry Pringle, Marino Lanza, and Paul Clammer. And I hopefully got everybody there. Everyone that registers will get an email with a link to the recording, any slides, previous webinars, and links to the 3 BJCP study groups. Whew. I'm glad to get all that behind us, Ron. So let's move into our program and what I'm calling the sordid history of British milds. So Ron, when we were first talking about this, and I said, well, milds will be great because I love session milds, or I love session beers. And you said, nope, what we're talking about is not so mild.
No, I think people who don't know the history of mild are often quite shocked when they see what some of the ones from the early 19th century were like. They were often very strong beers, and often, even by modern standards, quite heavily hopped. And it's because people don't understand what mild originally meant. But that comes up in the talk. I explain the origins of the term mild and how it's sometimes misinterpreted.
Well, are we ready to crack one open?
I think so, yeah.
All right. Well, I am going to do my best to share my beer cam, although it seems that my signal is poor at best, so we may not leave that open very long. But we're going to give it a...
I'm just going to show people what I'm drinking, which is a beer that's very local to me. Let's get that right. Yeah.
Yep. Let me bring you up full screen, Ron. There we go.
So this is The Last Possession, which is brewed by a brewery that's just a couple of minutes walk away from where I live here. So he's done quite a lot of my recipes. I think this is one of my recipes. I'm not actually sure, but I'm guessing it is just by the style. I'm guessing it's probably from about around 1900, based on the strength and the description of it.
Well, I am having, and I thought this was going to come up a little larger, but anyway, we'll go with what we got. Mine is actually from a Charleston brewery called Edmund's Oast, and this is Lord Proprietor. And this is a dark mild, and it's in the true, I guess, modern sense of a mild. And it actually has South Carolina black tea in it. So this will be fun to open and pour. So let's see what we've got here. So Ron, are you pouring yours?
Yeah, I'm going to give mine a go.
I'm going to pour it out very gracefully here. And before somebody busts my chop for my glass not being clean, I know it is not, and I just had to do the best I could. So this is not a good example of a beer clean glass. So anyway, that Edmund's Oast is kind of cute. I like that. So Ron, what are you getting off of yours?
I'm actually tasted it properly. This is just so you can see. My glass is clean, by the way. And I've got a nice head on the top of it anyway. It's banked up nicely. Oh, that's nice, actually. I'm getting quite a lot of fruit. Quite a bit of malt sweetness from the grain. And yeah, quite a nice balance of hops, so quite nice. Quite nicely drinkable, even though it is a full 5%.
Oh, wow. Now mine is a bit different than that. First of all, I've got absolutely no roast. Matter of fact, I'm not sure I would know it was a dark beer. Light fruit, a little earthy from the black tea. It's more tea-like than it is beer-like. But it's really interesting. It's very light, very drinkable.
Yeah, I mean, normally the classic flavors I'd associate with dark mild are things like plum, so dark fruit flavors, caramel, sometimes a tiny bit of roast, but normally not really, mostly because of the way that you're getting the color in the beer. And I was really surprised when I found out that actually the signature taste of mild is one of the sugars they use. And so that's what virtually all the milds I drank when I was younger. I realize now they all tasted a number 3 invert.
Well, now the body is really thin on this. So I wonder if they didn't use some sugar in this also.
Well, probably. Well, that's the proper way to brew a mild.
Yeah, it's very very thin, just above watery. But again, it's very pleasant. For a summertime beer, I think it would be fantastic.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're nice, light, easy drinking beers normally, modern milds. So yeah, my one's a bit different. Mine's, I don't know if you can see the color very well. I mean, this is billed as an amber mild.
All right, I'm going to take you full screen there, Ron, so we can all see what you've got.
So you can see mine is a good bit paler than yours, but this is typical of an earlier period of mild. So when you have it starting to go dark, which is why I guess this recipe is probably from about 1900. I'll have to ask actually the brewer what it is. So I should have asked him. I saw him yesterday. I should have asked him.
So when we were talking about porters, you talked about them being adulterated. Yeah. So I would say since they put tea and almost no hops in this, is this adulterated?
Well, they really did adulterate mild. And depending on the period, it varied how much it was, how much it was adulterated. But and there's a story behind. Well, there's a theory I have as to why mild became dark at a certain point. But we'll get onto that later.
Okay. Well, I think so. I think we can kind of wrap up the commercial calibration with that. But I do want to touch base. We've got quite an interesting audience, Ron. I thought you'd get a kick out of it. So, Umbra, Italy, Lebanon, Illinois, in the USA. Jane Price is hi from France, so she's in your time zone. Moscow, Mother Russia, Costa.
Kostya, I think.
Kostya, thank you, Ron. And Douglas from Garner, North Carolina. Dungle, Ireland. That's in your time zone, Ron. And London. So, and Brazil. And Britain, Berlin. So I would say we're covering at least most of the Western countries.
Yeah, that's quite good.
Well, welcome everybody. Again, we'll jump into this with Ron. And Ron, do you want ready for me to bring up a slide or two?
Yeah, you can start bringing up the slides.
All right.
Yeah, so I'm going to go through the history of mild a little bit. So if you can bring up the slides, we can see where so you don't just have to look at my ugly face. You'll have something to read as well.
All right, so I'm going to get it so you and the slide are full screen or as close to split screen as we can get it. How about that? So the audience will let me know if they can see this okay, and we'll keep going.
Okay. So I'm going to go through the history of mild. I mean, it's a bit depressing in a way, in that mild's gone from being incredibly popular to being virtually extinct. So as our troubles getting hold of it proved. So if you can show the next slide.
There we go. Cool.
So one of the reasons I got into studying beer history was mild, because I was interested in how it had developed over the years, especially seeing as when I first started drinking beer, it was what I mostly drank. So I've always been a bit old-fashioned. So I was drinking mild when it was already pretty unfashionable in the early 1970s. And when I started looking into the history of mild, initially at some of the big London breweries, when I started looking at the brewing records that had been preserved in archives, I was fairly surprised at what I found, and that the 19th century milds weren't at all what I'd expected. And it wasn't so much the strength, it was more the ingredients that were in them. So I realized mild had been stronger in the past, and I realized there'd been some quite strong ones, but I hadn't really realized how different it had been in a lot of other ways. A really interesting exercise I did a few years ago was with Pretty Things in Boston, Massachusetts, and they brewed the 1837 and the, I think it's 1945 version of Barclay Perkins XL. So exactly the same beer, the same brand from the same brewery, and the two beers were completely unalike. They had pretty much nothing in common with each other. But it was just how that beer had developed over the period of 100 years, and it had turned into something completely different from what it had started out as. And it's quite interesting to see how that happened with milds, how they changed, and how something that was continually being marketed by a brewery under the same name became so different from how it started out. But, yeah, okay. So there has been stuff called mild ale for quite a long while, but as a real recognizable style, it's only the early 19th century that you really start to get it. Before then, it was just a really vague term. All it meant was anything that was an ale that hadn't been aged for very long, because that's all mild means. It means unaged. And the name of the style isn't really mild. The name of the style is really ale, and mild is just a variety of ale. And so what you used to have with the two main types would be mild ale, which was sold young, and stock ale, which was sold aged. And so the London breweries had two parallel sets of beers. So they'd have 1X to 4X, 2K to 4K, and double X and double K would be identical recipes, apart from the fact that the K beer would have about 50% more hops, because that was going to be aged. And so that would be left 6 to 12 months before sale. But basically it was the same as the mild ale. It was just more heavily hopped because it'd need that to survive.
So Ron, if they weren't mild, where did the word mild, how did it get associated?
Mild just means unaged. All it means is young ale.
Well, I understand that, but I mean, what made that intuitive? I realize
it's just that language has changed. That's what mild meant then. I mean, the alternative you have, what they called aged beer, was stale, which also doesn't mean exactly the same nowadays as it did then. Because that looks really odd. You read an old text and they're going on about stale ale and stale beer, and they don't mean stuff that's gone off. They mean stuff that's been aged and that is still in drinkable condition. So it's one of the nightmares of looking at old texts. You have to be very careful about the way words were used, and to realize what they meant, and to realize that they might not mean what you think they mean. And especially brewing technologies, there's a lot which isn't very obvious and which people have misinterpreted a lot. The whole thing about porter comes from people not understanding the brewing term start.
Okay, but there's no easy way to remember, oh yeah, that stale, I mean, it's kind of intuitive. Stale could mean old. It's not terribly intuitive that mild could mean young.
Yeah, it's just the way it is. But I mean, people knew what it meant.
Okay.
So
I've been wanting to ask you this question a long time. I know I'm supposed to type them in, but I wanted to take advantage of my opportunity.
No, and so people have taken it to mean other things. So more recently, people have taken mild to mean something that's either low in alcohol or not very heavily hopped. And that's not where the term originates. And it makes sense to it applies to modern milds, but it doesn't apply to lots of milds in the past, which were often quite different. And so, yeah, the original ones, if you look at really when you first start getting mild being really established, so in the 1820s, 1830s, they're mostly pretty strong beers and pretty heavily hopped. So you're looking at beers which are way more heavily hopped than, say, modern English bitters would be, and infinitely more heavily hopped than modern mild. I mean, some of the mild recipes that I've done, when I run them through brewing software, they come out to over 100 IBUs. So
George Mason says mild as in maybe cheese that is not as mature. You think that's possibly? Because certainly,
yes, that's something similar.
Yeah,
and that is a similar usage for mild.
yeah. Hey, George, great analogy. I think I can stick with that one. All right.
So what you have in the 1830s and 1840s, mild starts to become very popular, and what you see is the classic set of milds is 1x to 4x. They're all very simple beers. Most of them are smash. One of my favorite recipes is an 1831 Truman's 4x, which is a London beer that comes out normally at about 10.5% alcohol. That's one of the ones that came out to over 100 IBUs calculated. I don't know if it was actually that in real life, but it was certainly a very bitter beer. And these are beers which are very dissimilar to modern ones. So most early 19th century beers are very simple. They're usually just pale malt, often just a single type of pale malt, and sometimes a single type of hops, sometimes a couple of different years, but very, very simple recipes. And the beers, none of them would be more darker than a sort of darkish amber. And the only reason they'd have that color is because they'd have so much pale malt in them, because they'd be quite massive beers. So there would be variation in color. And this is probably where you get people associating a darker color with a stronger beer, because that's just the way it went. If you're brewing a beer from all base malt, the differences in color are basically going to be down to how much malt there is in the beer. So it's going to be an indication of how strong it is. And I think people came to associate that with beers, and that might be one of the reasons mild starts getting dark at a certain point.
I'm going to take that one full screen.
Okay. So, I mean, if you look here, these are fairly typical mild ales from the 1830s. So you can see even an X ale is something that's going to come in at about 7% alcohol. And if you look at the strongest ones, and you can see that I've given one of the reasons I've got Reed as an example there is because they actually brewed an IPA. So just to give you an idea of the hopping levels, so you can see that the stronger milds weren't that much less heavily hopped than IPA, which just had insane amounts of hops in it at that time. I mean, if you look at the quantities that are in, I think this IPA from Reed, I think had about £7 per imperial barrel, something like that, which is a huge amount of hops. But I mean, you can also see from this that the milds are all stronger than the IPA. But yeah, you can flick over to the next one.
All right.
Okay. This is always one of my favorite topics, party guiling. I've had so many arguments about this.
You're relishing this.
No, it's nice to put the record straight. The description that's normally given in home brewing books of party guiling is not the way British breweries normally party guiled after 1800. They didn't use each guile straight to be one beer. That's not the way they did it. They had a much better way of doing it. And so what you'd do is you'd have, if you're talking about the early 19th century, they'd probably be 2 or 3 mashes and maybe 1 or 2 sparges. And so you get 4, maybe 5 worts. These would all be hopped and boiled separately. and then blended after the boil to get the original gravities that they wanted. And it was quite sophisticated. It was a way of using all the wort that you produced. It was a way of producing a whole range of milds. And especially with the stronger milds, they'd often be being produced in quite small quantities. So if you'd brewed them single guile, especially in the London breweries where they had brew lengths of 1,000 barrels often, it would have been incredibly uneconomic to brew something where you're only going to brew 100 barrels or maybe even 50 barrels. And so, of course, if you're party guiling, it doesn't matter because you'll brew a small amount of the strong beer and then you'll brew a much larger quantity of one of the weaker ones. So often you'll see X ales party guiled with 3X or 4X, and the vast majority of it actually turns out as being just the X, but it's just an easy way of producing these other beers without having to do massive batches of them. And so it was used very effectively. The example I always give is Fuller's, where they had a brew in the 1930s called Old Burton Extra. The largest batch of it I've ever seen was 10 barrels. Their brew length was 250 to 300. So to produce 10 barrels on that kit would be totally uneconomical unless you party guiled. And I mean, they still party guile at Fuller's. That's still how they brew. I mean, London Pride, Golden Pride, Fuller's ESB, they're all basically the same brew, and they all have the same two worts in them, just in different proportions, and that's how you get all the different beers.
So Ron, when we first started, you said each guile.
Yeah.
Now, I've always heard party guile expressed as one word. So what is a guile? I'll ask the dumb question.
Well, a guile's the same as a wort. So it means one lot of wort that you've got off a mash. So it's basically the two terms we used, either guile or wort. So you'd have 3 or 4 guiles or 3 or 4 worts, which you would blend. And that's basically how it works. And at one time, pretty much everyone was at it in the UK.
So is that a UK word, a guile versus wort?
Yeah, I mean, you see both.
I didn't know about the origin of the word. You're the first person.
Yeah, sometimes guile will be used to mean a batch as well. So if you look in a brewing record, each brew will have what they call a guile number, and so that's the number of that brew. But the normal term is guile number.
So is that unique to European? Well, I guess British or English beers.
Probably.
Okay.
But I'm sure that the terms would have been used in the US in the past because the terminology would have been identical at one point.
Right, but I'm saying...
And if I look at... I mean, I've seen some American brewing records from the 1830s and 1840s from Vassar in New York State, in Poughkeepsie. And their beers look like an English country brewery's beers, and they're brewing these, I think it's 3X, the normal one. It just looks like a stronger mild to me.
And so they use the word guile interchangeably with wort?
In Britain, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
At various points. So
I love that.
I'm digressing. Yeah. So basically that's party guiling. So it's completely different from what's normally said. It's a bit more complicated. But the good thing is that if you brewed a beer that was all from the last wort, it'd be pretty low quality wort that you'd got. Whereas with party guiling, even the weakest beer would have some of the strongest wort in it, so it'd have some of the better stuff in it. So it's a way of having a more even quality across all the different strength beers. So what you see is that mild gradually starts to replace porter. Outside London, quicker than in London. In London, porter's probably still on top until I think about the mid 1860s, something like that. Elsewhere, it's probably about 1850 where mild becomes more popular. And basically, it's the most popular style in Britain for over 100 years. What people often think is that porter was replaced by pale ale, but that's not true at all. pale ale only became the most common style in Britain in the 1960s. And for most of the 19th century, it was very much a minority drink. It was what was drunk by the middle classes because it was expensive. So what you see is that the gravities are tending to start to go down, but it's still 100% pale malt, and they're still fairly strong beers. So I mean, the gravities I'm giving here, these are London ones, which tend to be a bit higher than in the rest of the country, but they were the largest breweries at the time. So it's what an awful lot of the beer was like, was this sort of strength. And these are some examples of mild ales from the 1860s. So you can see by this point, these are both London breweries. You can see that they've lost the strongest mild, the 4X, but they're still both brewing several different strands. So if you see the one called XL, the Whitbread one, that means the L stands for London, or that's what it normally does in these circumstances. And so you can see they were brewing a stronger beer for London, whereas their standard X was a little bit weaker. But these are, yeah, pretty typical London miles from this sort of period. And if you see the hopping rates, they're pretty high. Anyway, we can move on. I don't want to bore people too much. If you want to consult all these things at your leisure, I'll be making the slides available so you can go through and look at all these tables. You have a big change that comes around in 1880 when you have the free mash tun. And that allows brewers to use pretty much what they like as long as it's food safe. So yeah, they had allowed sugar in to be used after 1847, but it's 1880 when it really opens up. And then one of the things you see is, as well as a lot more sugar being used, you also get a lot of use of corn or maize, usually in the form of flakes. And so that becomes pretty much standard in British breweries. I'd say of the brewing records I've looked at, probably 80% used flake maize. Then some of the other 10%, probably 5% of those were using some other adjunct. And you're looking at a fairly small percentage of breweries that were using no adjuncts at all. This is also the period where mild starts to get darker, which is one of the great mysteries why it went dark. I've got some theories. One is that because they're using a lot more sugar, it's a lot easier for brewers to control the color of the beer, because what they do is, and what you see later, is they use sugar for colored sugars for color adjustments, or caramel for color adjustments, so that they can get all sorts of different shades. So whereas at one point either beer would be pale, beer brewed from all pale malt, or it would be porter or stout and pretty dark. And it's when they start using sugar that you can get shades in between those. And so they've got a lot more control over it. So I think that might be one of the reasons why it starts getting darker. The other one is an incredibly cynical one, which is that when porter started going out of fashion, publicans needed a cheap dark beer to put all the slops into, where they wouldn't be seen. And porter had been where it had gone before. And as draft porter starts disappearing towards the end of the 19th century, then maybe landlords were keen on having dark milds. So they got something they could put all the stuff in where it wouldn't be very obvious. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but maybe I'm being too cynical. And you can see that there's a difference in the strength. So around 1900, the London miles were somewhere between 1050 and 1055, so a bit over 5%. Whereas when you go outside London, especially in the rural districts, sometimes the beers were a good bit weaker than that. In fact, quite a bit weaker. I was surprised when I came across beers that were under 4% alcohol before World War I, because I hadn't thought you got beer that weak at that point. So it was quite a surprise to find that there were the odd milds that were only 3.5–4%, even in sort of like the immediate pre-World War One period. Flick over again. And here's some more. Here's some London milds. So you can see here that they're brewing far fewer. I mean, Whitbread by 1889 were down to a single mild. That was all they brewed. Barclay Perkins had got 2, Truman's had got 2, Fuller's had got 2. But you can see these are all still pretty strong beers. They're all, 5, 6, 7% alcohol. So they're decent beers. But at this point, these beers would be still pale. So they don't have, at this point, they don't have any coloured malt in them at all. If you can go over to the next one. So when you get into the earlier 20th century, there's still downward pressure on gravities. One of the problems is that just before World War One, the brewing industry was in quite a bit of trouble. The taxes had gone up. None of them were making much in the way of money. The only way they could really cope with the increase in taxation was to drop the gravities, just because the way the pricing worked, that they couldn't put up the price of beer by 10% because there weren't coins of that smaller value, and beer was only 2p a pint. So if your smallest coin is a quarter penny, then you can't put up a beer by 10% if it's cost 2p a pint to start with. And so what they did was that whenever the taxation went up, they just cut the gravity so they could sell the beer for the same price. You see in London, Whitbread's interesting that the balance between bitter and mild was already changing before World War One, and you see that some of their bitters are starting to get quite popular and are starting to catch up with their mild. And in fact, I think with Whitbread, I think they might even catch up before World War II or in the early 1950s, which is quite early. But even though the mild's getting darker, there's rarely anything darker in it than crystal malt. Occasionally there's a bit of black malt, but not very often. And any colour that you're getting, it's normally coming from some form of sugar. So either something like number 3 invert, which is a dark sugar, or some form of caramel. And what you find is there's all these proprietary things, all these companies, sugar companies are making all these different products. And quite a lot of them are these dark sugars specifically made for mild and specifically to brew relatively sweet and relatively dark milds. And so this becomes a big business. All these sugar manufacturers have all got these different products. It makes life difficult for me because it's hard to replicate those, partly because I don't really know what the composition of a lot of them was. I have some idea of what some of them were, but not really precise. Whereas with the numbered invert sugars, they're still available, so it's easier to pin those down. And so these are some provincial milds around 1900. So you can see it's like that one Lees beer, which is only 3.5% ABV. That's very weak. So Lees is a brewery that's still going. People from the UK know that they're a brewery in Manchester. And Adnams at the top, they're also still going. They're out in a lovely little town in Suffolk. In fact, one of the prettiest towns in Britain where they're based. It's got a lighthouse right in the centre of town. In fact, the lighthouse is really close to the brewery. So very scenic. World War One was pretty cataclysmic for British beer in lots of ways. Well, for everything other than the business, weirdly. So there were loads of government restrictions during World War One, especially in the last 2 years when there were problems with the German U-boat campaign and the grain supplies were getting low. So there's all sorts of restrictions on strengths and how much brewers are allowed to brew, what ingredients they could use. I mean, at a certain point in 1917, they passed a regulation banning all malting of any type. And brewers just had to use the stocks that they got. And for a while, they couldn't get any new malt. No new malt was made. Was pretty dramatic. And you had this stuff, that these price-controlled beers that the government had regulations for, and they got called government ale. And government ale was normally a very weak, mild. In the first days, it might have been about 3%. Then later on, it was getting down to 2%, or, I mean, really pathetically weak. The weakest government ale I've seen was one from Whitbread, which was 1.1% ABV, which doesn't really count as beer. So you got some very weak and watery milds during World War One. And the reason mild was affected more than other styles is because it was very popular. It was a big incentive because it was popular and it was cheap. There was a big incentive for brewers to try and cut the gravity of that, because at certain points during the price controls, you were allowed. There were some categories at certain strengths where there was no control on the price. So if you knocked down the strength of the weaker beers, but you'd have to brew all your beer would have to be a certain gravity. So at a certain point, all the beer you brewed could be no stronger than 1036, the average of it. At another point, it got down to 1030. So if you brewed a lot of beer at 1020, that meant you could brew some beer at 1040 or 1050, where you're going to make much more profit. And so that's what brewers did. And so mild stuff had proportionally worse than a lot of the other beer styles, just for that reason, just because it was popular. And so here you can see what happened to courage mild during World War One. So you can see it starts off at getting on for 5% alcohol, and at the low point it gets down to just over 2. And then you can see that after the end of the war, it starts getting back, but it never gets back to its previous level. So you can see that was pretty dramatic. I mean, at some points, the strength of beer was changing like every month or two. It must have been very confusing for drinkers, and the price going up like crazy. The tax increased in World War One by, what was it, about 12-fold, I think it was, the tax on beer. So it went from just under 8 shillings to 80 shillings. And these are the grists. So you can see this gives you some idea of what they were brewing from. So you can see here they were actually using black malt, and that's probably, which they weren't doing, as you can see, very much before the war. And they were probably putting up the black malt percentage just to keep the colour in the beer, just so it didn't go too pale. But I mean, that's fairly typical, just mostly pale malt and some crystal malt and sugar. But the only difference here is there isn't any maize in this. Most breweries would have had some flake corn in there as well. We can continue on. So one of the weird things about World War One is they had these very strict price controls with gravity bands. And everyone seems to have stuck to those after the war. So really, they last through till World War II. And so you have these 3 classes of milds. So ones that cost 4p, 5p, or 6p a pint with different gravities. Not everyone made all of them. Some parts of the country, they mostly make the weaker ones. Mild pretty much completely disappears from Scotland after World War II. I can find, with the exception of one brewery, William Younger, I can find virtually no mild ales that were brewed as such in Scotland. Even though I've got the brewing records from several breweries, none of them were brewing a mild apart from William Younger. So it's quite strange the way that happened so quickly, because before the World War One they did brew them, but everyone seems to have stopped after World War One, and basically most breweries in Scotland just brewed pale ales. They didn't brew anything else. Scottish brewing is, as I told you last time, Scottish brewing can be incredibly boring. And with the brewers just basically having one recipe they brew everything from. And so I'm sure some of the Scottish brewers were marketing stuff as mild, but it would have just been their weakest pale ale with caramel put in it. And that's a trick that's started happening in Britain later on when mild started going out of fashion. That's what a lot of breweries did in the 60s and 70s, is they would just colour up their ordinary bitter with caramel at racking time and call it mild, because there wouldn't be enough demand for mild for it to be worth brewing one. So they just sort of put one together from another beer. And I'm sure the Scots were doing that in the 20s and 30s because they were demons for colouring stuff with caramel.
So Ron, the 4D, 5D, 6D is, I'm not.
That's the price per pint.
What is the D? What's a D?
That's an old penny.
Okay. All right.
So 4D, well, 6D, that is 2.5 new p. So these aren't exactly huge prices, but obviously there's been a lot of inflation since then.
Sure. Okay. I just want to make sure yep.
Yeah. But when I say that the price, that's the price per pint in a public bar, as opposed to in one of the other bars in a pub. So only that price only counts for the public bar. So here you can see here's some London milds from between the wars, and you can see these mostly fit into. You can see a lot of the breweries have got a fourpenny one and a sixpenny one, so one in the high 1020s and then one over 1040. What you can't see from here is that the weaker milds, so the ones that were in the 1020s, generally the quantities of those brewed were way smaller than of the other milds. So you're looking at probably something like at least 10 to 1, the stronger one to the weaker one. And later in the 30s, probably 20 or 30 to 1. So they weren't brewed in huge quantities. I sometimes wonder where they went, because they weren't brewing enough to supply a huge number of pubs. So it must have just been a few grotty pubs that took the really cheap one. Can carry on again. Next big thing you had happen was the Wall Street crash had a really bad effect on the British economy. And so you had this big tax rise in 1931 on beer, which is a complete disaster, actually ended up raising less money than the lower tax rate. And British brewers did what they always did when the tax went up. They reduced the strength. And so they basically just knocked the strength down so they could continue to sell it for the same price with the higher tax. And so what had been the sixpenny class of something around 4 and a bit % was cut down to around 1036. So this is when you really start saying, so up until this point in London, the standard mild had been over 4% or a little bit over 4%. And so this is when you see most of the mild brewed in London fall under 4%. So even though there were some stronger ones still brewed, so in particular, Barclay Perkins continued to brew their stronger mild, but they changed the name. What they did was they introduced what they called a new beer, which was 2X, but it was actually the old X ale at the old X ale gravity, whereas the beer they then called X ale was at a lower strength. So effectively, they introduced a new beer at the lower strength, even though they gave it the old name, if you see what I mean. It's a bit complicated. And what you see is, this is a process that seems to start in the 1930s, where people aren't very happy about the quality of draft beer often. And you see that British brewers really struggled after World War I with the reduction in strengths. And it actually takes them a couple of decades to get the hang of brewing lower gravity beers, and especially cask beer. And I've got some quite good information on where people from one brewery, Whitbread, actually went round and bought samples of other breweries' beers in their pubs, and then analysed them, but also had comments on the flavour and the condition of the beer. So you can see that a lot of the cask beer was in very bad condition in the 1920s, especially the weaker ones. And I can see why porter really went out of fashion quickly, because the porter was almost always in bad condition, which is a sure sign that it wasn't selling very well. And so it was staying on for too long. It wasn't a very strong beer anymore. So it'd only be good for a couple of days after the cask was opened. So if you weren't selling it very quickly, it was going to be in crap condition, and then people weren't going to want to drink it. And so this is, I mean, Barclay Perkins, that ended up with quite a range of milds in the late 1930s because of this. So you had 3 different strengths, A, X, and 2X. And you also got them in different colour variations. So the paler colour, the light one, that's actually what colour they were when brewed. The dark colour they achieved by coloured primings. So at racking time, they'd add really high gravity sugar. So something that was about, I think normally primings are about 1150, something like that. And they'd add, I think normally about half a gallon per 36 gallon barrel. And that would be enough to change the colour considerably. So that's why you've got the 2 different colours for the beers. They weren't actually really different beers. So some of the stuff that was, so the light and the dark, they could really have been the same brew, but just some of it was coloured. It was simple as that, nothing very complicated. So what you have happen is during World War II, there's pressure again on gravities downwards, and so you see people dropping beers. What happens to the 4D ale is basically standard X ale drops down to pretty much the same gravity, so there's nowhere for the weaker one to go. And you also have to understand, because of the way the tax system worked in the UK, it wasn't economic to brew anything under 1027, because you'd still have to pay the tax as if it was 1027 anyway. So it really was crazy to brew anything weaker. So that's really a baseline. And so when you look at the beers that we just seen from Barclay Perkins, of those 5 milds, you had 2 of them discontinued in, I think, 1940. And then by the end of the war, you've only got 1 left, that they've discontinued all the rest of them. Some of the mid-war ones are really weird, because you had this thing in the mid-1940s where there was a really big crop of oats, and so the government forced the brewers to use 10% oats in all their beers, which didn't go down great with brewers, but it got rid of these surplus oats and it saved on barley. So the government made people do it, and there were various times that brewers were forced to do stuff by the government. When you look at recipe changes during World War II, very few of them were voluntary. Normally they were forced by some sort of restriction. So, I mean, if you this is what happened to Whitbread mild during World War II. You can see that what happened in the 2 wars was quite different. In World War I, beers stayed pretty much the same until early 1917, and then there's really drastic cuts in gravity. What you had happen in World War II was you have a bit of a change in the first couple of years of the war, and then from 1942 onwards, beer gravity stays pretty much the same. So they're obviously coping better with getting the raw materials. Also started taking measures much more quickly in World War II. They really boosted barley production by some ridiculous percentage during the war, which meant Britain could basically become self-sufficient in brewing materials, which I guess was the idea. So they didn't have to import anything. So even hops, so you see that foreign hops disappear, American barley disappears, which had been pretty common during the interwar period, and everything goes back to just being purely British ingredients. So it's really odd that in the 1940s, British brewing becomes self-sufficient probably for the first time in 100 years in the basic brewing ingredients. It's quite strange. and remains that way for a bit after the war, but then that all changes with the collapse of the British hop industry. So this is what happened to the Whitbread mild ale grists. So you can see they're sometimes using mild malt. In fact, at a certain point, Whitbread went over using mild malt as a base on a lot of their beers, so even their pale ales. And so you can see that the sort of everything's changing because all the corn had to be imported at the time. You can see that none of that's in any of these wartime recipes because they couldn't get it. And what the main substitute they had was flaked barley, though for a while, as I just explained, flaked oats. And then, yeah, number 3, invert sugar, wheat malt, and crystal malt. So, I mean, this is relatively complicated, but again, you can see there's nothing very dark in there. I mean, what you can see in the other sugar, the quite small percentage in most of them, that's some sort of caramel, some sort of proprietary caramel. So basically, all of the color here is coming from the number 3 and the caramel, and maybe a little bit from the crystal, but it's not really coming from any malt, or not to any great degree. If you can carry on, it's normally the biggest mistake with American brewed milds is that they tend to try and use dark grains to get the color, and so they taste too harsh, and they don't have the really typical dark malt flavors, the dark, not dark malt, but the dark fruit flavors that you get from number 3 invert, which is for me the signature flavor of dark mild, or at least post World War II dark mild. So this is looking at after World War II. So you see people introducing best milds, but I mean the best milds we'll see in the next slide. But with when there's some analyses, they weren't actually that strong mostly, and you get very few milds that are over 1037. There is the odd one, but even most best mild is weaker than that. So it's not actually anything very strong. I mean, the last best milds were actually still around when I started drinking. There were a couple of the northern breweries that were still producing 2 milds, an ordinary mild and a best mild, but you didn't see that very often. What's interesting is the variation in color. And so what you tend to see is that in London, the milds were very dark. Probably, I've just got to do this in SRM now, probably usually at least 20 SRM. Whereas in a lot of the other parts of the country, there was somewhere between bitter and dark mild in color. So sort of like half dark. So something like, I don't know, 12 SRM, something like that. So not really dark, but dark enough to be distinguished from bitter, if you see what I mean. So it's sort of a strange period. But in some parts of the country, they're noticeably a lot lighter than in London. So if you go to the next slide, we can see some examples.
I want to interrupt briefly. And I really did have a mild. It didn't sound like I was off to that, but I really did. It is the top of the hour. And yeah. I know a lot of folks have been with us an hour, possibly those that you got on early, maybe a little more than that. And Ron, first of all, I know you've got a few more slides. Can you keep going? Are you good?
Yeah, I'm good. Okay. No problem.
All right. And I know it's getting late where you are. So I know it's pretty late. And for several other folks on the European side of the country, we know it's late. You're going to hang in there and still get to questions, though, correct?
Yeah. I'll still be around.
Cool.
No problem.
All right. So I wanted to let everybody know, if those that need to run, we all completely understand this will be recorded, so you can catch the end of it later. If you want to submit your question and run, your questions will still be answered by Ron as long as he hangs in there. And so if you need to ask your question, run. You'll actually get a unique email that comes from us with your answer started right where Ron answers it. So you don't even have to watch the whole webinar if you don't want to. So we appreciate you coming. And Ron, if you're good, we're going to continue on with a few more slides and then get to the questions.
Okay, good.
All right.
And so what you see again after World War II is that there's a lot of complaints about beer quality. And so what people start doing is mixing beers, mixing draft and bottled beers, because people can't really afford to drink all bottled beer, but they're often not very happy about the condition of the draft beer. So if you mix half of mild with a bottle of brown ale, then you get something that's in better condition, but not as expensive as trying to drink a whole pint of bottled beer. And so it becomes, so mild and brown becomes popular. And you have an equivalent with bitters, light and bitter. So bottled light ale and ordinary bitter, and the bottled and draft equivalents of each other. And here's a fairly random, these are mostly country breweries or breweries outside the larger cities. And so this is just showing the grist to some of those. And you can see, again, it's mostly either pale or mild malt base, crystal malt and sugar. And there's only the one example there that's got any black malt in it. And I would say this was pretty typical, these sorts of grists. You can see on the top line, the enzymic malt. That's a weird thing that they had in Britain for a while. It was incredibly popular in the 40s and 50s when people were really paranoid, British brewers, about the diastatic activity of their base malt. And so you see often there's diastatic malt extract or this enzymic malt in the grist, because they're worried that they're not going to have enough enzymes for conversion, and I think it was all a load of rubbish, really. It's odd. It's none of the large breweries I've found did it. It tends to only be the smaller or medium-sized breweries. So maybe they didn't know their science quite as good. Here's some milds and best mild. So yeah, you can see that even most of the best milds aren't that strong. I think there's only the one over 1040 there. But here you can see quite well the difference in the color. That number there, you have to divide by about 4 to get SRM. So you can see that the London ones are a lot darker than the other ones, which are both from Yorkshire, so in the north of England. In 1960, mild was still about 50% of the market. The sales start to go into a steep decline. By the time you get through to the 1970s, early to mid 1970s, it's like maybe about 12-15% of sales, and it continues to go down. And I don't know what it is nowadays. It's probably about 1 or 2%. It's very small. And so what you see, first it disappears in some bits of the south, the southwest, London. When I started drinking, there were various parts of the country where you basically couldn't get mild, or it was very difficult. So I'm talking about the 73, 74, 75. Most of the north and the Midlands, you could still get it. It was still pretty mainstream, but it was already getting to be pretty marginal in a lot of the south, and especially London. It virtually mid-1970s, there was virtually no mild around. It was very well, especially in cask form. It was pretty much dead as a doornail. You occasionally saw keg Whitbread best mild, but there wasn't very much around. But it was still quite strong. Some parts of the West Midlands. I mean, when I was at university in Yorkshire, pretty well certainly all the Tetley's pubs sold mild, and sold cask mild, and sold it in reasonable quantities. These are some of the late London dark milds. Yeah, you can see they're all around 3% alcohol. Yeah, not hugely exciting beers. and quite a few of those were probably sold in keg form, which doesn't help. Mild doesn't work, as you can see, I say here, mild doesn't work very well in if it's not served on cask, because it just ends up tasting thin and not very interesting. Whereas if you serve it on cask, it can come across quite well. But a beer of 3% served on keg, it's very difficult to make it work, in my opinion. And I think it's one of the reasons British beers continue to be on cask longer than elsewhere in the world was for that reason, because they were weaker and because you really didn't end up with something very nice often if you kegged it, because you just end up with something thin and bland and generally uninteresting. Yeah, I mean, there've been some revivals of stronger versions. I was over in Sheffield a couple of months ago, and the people who used to run Pretty Things have got a brewery there, and they brewed my favourite again. So 1831's 4X Mild from Truman, which is one of my favourite beers of all time. So they brewed that up again. I don't know if it is specifically for me, but they had it there, so I was happy enough to drink that. So that was nice. That's a really insanely strong one and really heavily hop one. It's good because it's a great brewery breaking beer because it has so many hops in it. So, in fact, I'm surprised Dan brewed it again with the whole leaf hops, because it almost broke his brewery last time he did it. It was a different brewery, but it almost broke this one as well when he did it. So yeah, I'm quite good at ruining people's breweries for them, or at least giving them days of cleaning up work. So here I've just done a little bit of stuff on. I don't know if we have to go through this so much. Just a little stuff on brown ale, just the history of that, because it has some stuff in common with mild. I mean, I think a lot of people don't realise that there was nothing called brown ale really brewed for around a century or more in the UK. And it's only really in the 1920s that modern brown ale became a mainstream style. And the original ones are often quite different. They're actually quite diverse, the original ones. And they gradually get duller. And by the time you get through to the 1940s and 1950s, I often can't find them at all in the brewing books, because they didn't brew them as separate beers. All they'd be would be the mild, and they might have primed it with slightly different sugars and they bottle it, but it was still essentially their mild. So it didn't merit it wouldn't appear separately in the brewing books. It'd just be something that would be created at racking and bottling time. So yeah, it sort of became a bit dull, but you do get some other interesting examples. I mean, William Younger had a thing called Double Century Ale, which was about 4.5% alcohol, quite an interesting grist. That's one of their beers that had lactose in it. So, but later on, it basically just became bottled dark mild. I mean, currently brown ale is in an even worse state than mild ale. There's hardly anyone brews one anymore, especially the traditional type ones. I think you got Mann's and maybe a couple of others. Harvey's, I think, brew one. And then obviously you've got the stronger things like Newcastle Brown Ale, which is still a reasonably big brand, but the weaker type of brown ale is pretty much completely dead. So, but yeah, that's my talking bit done. So now you can throw the questions at me.
All right. Now, do you need to get another beer?
I'm okay at the moment. I might get one in a second. So
Okay.
I've got one of I've got my favourite cheap beer behind me. So.
Your favorite cheap beer?
Yeah.
I'd like to hear what that is. Okay.
My favourite cheap, I can show you what my favourite cheap beer is.
Well, I can read the bock.
Amstel.
That doesn't look anything like the ones we have in the U.S.
Oh, I don't think they sell this over there.
Ah.
This is the best beer that Heineken brew.
All right. Well, Ron, we're going to jump into the questions. You've got 8 right now.
Okay.
And
shall I click on the question thing then?
No, let me read them to you, and unless I do a terrible job. So the first one is from Craig, and Craig says, what are your must-try historical mild recipes?
Ooh, depends what you're after. There's different period ones. I would say The older ones, definitely the one I just mentioned, the 1831 4X mild. That's in my homebrewer's guide to vintage beer. If you're interested in that. What else? Depending on the period, the Tetley's one, which a couple of people have mentioned in the comments, has always gone down very well. The 1945 Tetley's mild. There's a Lee's Best mild from the mid-1950s, which has been very popular. A lot of people have really liked that one. That's one that actually does include quite a few dark malts in it, so it's quite an unusual mild recipe. But a lot of people like that. I quite like the just fairly straight ahead 19th century one, so just like an 1830s or 1840s Exile, which would be about 7% alcohol, but quite hoppy, but quite a straightforward beer. Yeah, just don't think what else.
Where could we get these recipes, Ron? Like, because it looks like Randall said that he has poured a mild brewed from Ron's 1945 Tetley recipe. Where would we find that?
I'm trying to think if that's in the Homebrewer's Guide to Vintage Beer. It might be. I can't remember. My problem is I write so many recipes and I put them in different books that I have to remember where it is. So it might be in Let's Brew, because that's got quite a lot of mild recipes in it as well.
Well, if Randall likes it, I want to know what it is. So we'll try and share that with everyone. We won't put you on the spot now, Ron.
It's been published on the blog.
Okay.
So if you just search on my blog, you should be able to find it.
And tell everybody what your blog is.
Shut Up About Barclay Perkins. So that's easy to find.
Thank you, Craig. I really like that question because I want to brew one. So the next one is from Chris. Hey, Chris. That's a near neighbor of mine. You touched on the use of invert sugar at HomebrewCon in Providence. It appears to be relatively easy to make. Any thoughts on the proportion of invert sugars in mild recipes, i.e. 5% or 20%?
It's normally between 10 and 15. In exceptional cases, maybe 20%, but it's not normally that much. Normally between 10 and 15% is invert sugar.
Okay, and Rob Cass added to that, I think, and the color of the invert sugar 3.
Yeah, that is, let me think. I think that's 70 SRM, about.
Did you say 70?
Yeah, 70.
Wow. I mean, that's beyond black.
Is that right? 70 SRM? Or is it 35?
40 is what a stout would be. 35, 40.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite dark. It's probably not that dark.
Rob.
I can't remember it off the top of my head what the color is. But Rob, I know where I've got it written down. So.
Well, that's okay, Ron. We'll maybe we can get that one to him. Chris, great question, because Excelsior has added to that. Are you talking about medium or fully inverted?
I think it's supposed to be fully, but I would definitely have to look that up. Sugar isn't my biggest area of expertise. I keep learning that there's loads of places that aren't my biggest area of expertise.
Well, we don't stump you often, so I think this is great. Good job, Chris. Well, Ron, do you want to move on to the next one, and we'll follow up with that one?
Yeah, we can just move ahead.
Okay. So Tom asked this one. During World War I, you have a table showing a gradual decrease in original gravity, but weirdly, a massive increase in hops. Then as the original gravity increases again, the hops reduce. Is that to increase flavor and mouthfeel?
Well, they were probably trying to compensate to some extent because it varied during the wars. At some points, they actually had plenty of hops, so they didn't seem to. So they might use more of them, but other points there were shortages. So it varies during the war. In World War II, you generally see the hopping rates go down as the war progresses. But it's in World War One, it's a bit more complicated. Okay, let's have a look. Number 3 invert, 120 to 140 EBC, which is 60 to 70 SRM. I thought
Yes.
SRM's about half, isn't it?
I'm not going to answer that because I don't know. Craig posted up there 30 EBC over 2 equals 65 EBC over 3 equals 130 EBC. You can see that in the comments. Might be easier to follow.
Yeah.
And then somebody else says Ragus invert number 3 is 120 EBC.
Yeah, that's about right. That's what I just saw. Yeah. So it is quite dark, but it adds a fair bit of color. It's not the darkest invert. I mean, number 4 is I think about 150 or something crazy SRM. It's very dark.
And it doesn't have any burnt sugar flavors?
I'm not sure. I've never tasted number 4.
Yeah.
I've only tasted number 2 and number 3. It's not that it's actually really difficult to, unless you make it yourself, to get hold of this stuff.
Yeah. Well, I have to find out where Chris is going to get his, or we might be making it. All right. Thank you, Tom. That was a great question. The next one comes from Glenn. Is it possible the early high gravity milds, just a second, the high gravity milds were diluted for sale?
Certainly not before 1830, because they had loads of rules about this. So there'd be no reason to dilute them because they were brewing weaker ones anyway.
Okay.
I mean, they would sort of be diluted before sale, but not officially, because the watering was rife at various points in pubs. So there probably were a lot of them that were watered down before they were sold, but that wasn't sort of official policy from everyone. That was just people who ran pubs trying to make more money.
All right. Tom's got the next question. Hi, I brewed what I considered a fantastic mild in the middle of July, kegged. Kegging up my mild in August with a small amount of cane sugar. It's been kept cold and on CO2 at 2.3 volumes. How long can I expect it for aging? Is the higher hopped ales for aging analogous to higher hopped ales sent to India? And are they contemporaries? So I guess the question is...
Well, yeah. I mean, the thing you have to realize is that lots of beers were sent to India, not just IPA. So, I mean, the most common beer to send was porter. Yeah, well, mild ales, they were the more lightly hop version. So it's stock ales, which were really hop like IPA. So IPAs, I mean, this is what they say, is that the original pale ales were all counted as stock ales in the UK. And it's only in the 1850s that you start to get the non-stock pale ales, which develop into modern bitter, so what you call a running bitter, so something that's ready for sale quite quickly. Whereas the original pale ales, like Bass, I mean, those things were a year old before they were sold, minimum. And so you have the same thing with the stock ales, which were the more heavily hopped versions of mild ales. And so those things, the stronger ones, were hopped at similar levels to IPA. And for the same reason, just for preservation. So it's always the same, that hops were mostly used for their preservative qualities, not for flavor, or not principally for flavor. The main reason people were putting in lots and lots of hops was because they wanted the beer to not go off.
Well, that was a good question. I like that. So the bottom line is as he referenced from the India market, is if you're going to make milds, you ought to make sure you got plenty of hops, and you want it to age. Yeah,
if anything you're going to age or export or ship any long distance, you're going to put a lot of hops in it just so it can stay good.
All right, we've got one from Jane Price, and I think Jane is in your time zone, Ron, so she's up late also. Thanks, Ron and Doug. Really interesting. Shows how much beer is a reflection of our social history. And I would add our taxation history. My local landlord was rumored to have poured all the slops from the other beers into the mild cask, but it always tasted okay.
Yeah, well, this is how much of this went on. It is hard to say. There's so many stories about it. I'm pretty sure it did. I used to drink Tetley's Mild, and Tetley's Mild only ever tasted right to me when it was served through what they called a univac or an economizer. And so this was a system where you had this trough underneath the tap. When they pulled the beer, they pull it over the top of it, it'd go back down into the trough, and then that'd have some device that fed it back in to the pipe, bringing the beer up. So you were always getting some beer that had been slopped over the top whenever you bought a pint. But to me, it only ever tasted right served that way. And when they had it served through completely hygienic electric pumps, it just didn't taste as good. Simple as that. I had plenty of experience of drinking Tetley's, and it never tasted right unless it was served in what was, in some ways quite a disgusting way.
Yeah, I'm biting my tongue.
No, it tasted lovely because that's how you get the proper head on the top of it. So,
well, mine came out of a very hygienic can, or at least I believe it did. Oh, that was a great question, Jane. All right, so we've got a couple more, Ron, and they're pouring in, but I promise everybody we are wrapping up shortly. Just a couple more questions. So this is from Excelsior. If they were taxed on the original gravity, it wouldn't save them to dilute unless the government lets you recalculate. True? Like high gravity brewing now.
Yes. High gravity brewing wasn't allowed in Britain until they changed the law. And it was for that reason that basically the way it worked was they'd come round and check the gravity of the beer, or the excise men could come round and check the gravity of the beer before it started fermenting to make sure you'd filled in the right number in the brewing book, because that number determined what the tax was. It made sense for the publicans to water it down later on,
but not the brewers.
Not the brewers, no.
Yeah. Depends on who you're talking about, who them is. So with the brewers, it made no sense, but the publicans, it could.
Yes. And then during the war, sometimes they had different regulations where you do see them watering down the beer, but that's because their brewings, they don't want to brew the beer so weak that the yeast won't have time to grow in it. Because they started having some yeast problems when they were brewing, when all the beers were just being 1030 or below. So sometimes they brew a stronger beer and then water it down, just so they'd have good yeast health. And so they'd have some good yeast to repitch.
Yeah, speaking of yeast, Brian, talking about your economizer, said, well, maybe to taste right, it needed some special bacteria.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it definitely worked for me, but I don't know other people who are big fans of it served that way.
All right, we've got just a couple of more questions, Ron. All right, so this one is from Coleman. What do you think of Sarah Hughes Ruby Mild at 5.6%?
Oh, it's a really nice beer. It's a lovely little brewery as well. If you ever get the chance to go out to the Beacon Hotel, I would definitely go there because it's a beautiful old pub. And the brewery at the back is just amazing. It's this miniature tower brewery. So it's like a classic Victorian tower brewery, but just on a really small scale. Very interesting and a nice beer.
Well, but I think he's questioning it at 5.6%. Is it really a mild?
Well, yeah, it's just an old mild. It's It's just like a 19th century strength one. I mean, a large percentage of mild before 1914 was over 5% alcohol.
So it might be a good historical recreation.
Yeah, I mean, if depending on how far you go back, mild didn't get weaker than about 6 or 7% at some periods. So, yeah, 5.6% is fine.
So I think the answer is, Coleman, yes, you like it.
Yeah, it's a nice beer as well.
Yeah. Well, I'll have to try that next time over there on the other side of the pond. All right. Next one comes from Jane, and mild seems to be very much on the up, particularly in the homebrew scene. I've tasted some great smoked versions recently. Are there any historical precedents?
Yes, probably, depending on yeah, because in some parts of Britain the malt tended to be smoky at a certain point, especially in the 18th century. So there were beers that were smoky. You see them complaining about beer from the southwest of England, saying that it had this horrible smoky flavour that only the locals could stomach, which is what some people think about smoked beer nowadays as well. So yes, I'm sure there were milds that would have had some smoke character in the past, especially the further back you go. But once you get probably past about the 1850s, it would be unlikely unless it was a domestically brewed beer where they'd also made their own malt. And there probably weren't very many people doing that by that point.
My personal opinion on smoke, and I've judged a lot of smoked beers, is I find Beechwood seems to have the most pleasant smoke to my palate.
Okay.
What about, I mean, what woods any idea what woods they would have, to go back to our historical precedent as Jane asked?
Well, a variety of woods, but I know the ones that they used, because there's this discussion on Martin Cornell's blog about, or he wrote a blog post on this about what they used for kilning brown malt, because I'd been saying it was hornbeam, which is something I'd read somewhere, and he'd looked into it a bit more, and hornbeam's a certain type of hardwood, but he'd found out that in fact it was a variety of woods that they used, so beech, birch, oak, but generally hardwood.
Wow, even American oak, because the Brits didn't really like American oaks for barrels, right?
Yeah, no, because they'd be just using stuff that was locally available firewood, so they wouldn't be importing wood just to burn it.
Yeah. Another good question. We're almost done here, Ron. Let's see. This one comes from Bill. In lieu of difficult to procure invert number 3 sugar, could one use Special B to introduce those dark fruit flavors you like so much and are crucial to the authentic milds?
Yes, you probably could. I don't know. I've not tasted Special B, but I know the sort of Belgian beers that it goes into. So the things like Belgian Double, and they definitely got some similar flavors to British mild. So my guess is that you would get similar sorts of flavor, probably not identical, but it would be far better than just using table sugar or corn syrup, using something like that, because it is a proper brewing sugar.
Well, Ron, that's the last question. It's getting late, and I think we can wrap up now. So thank you for spending so much time with us this evening. And audience, we appreciate you. And Ron, we appreciate you. This was just great. I've learned all kind of things. I think especially I appreciate the word guile now.
Oh, good.
But this was so fun. The miles, we got to do the commercial calibration with some nice beers. So that was neat, and some great questions. So if you enjoyed this, know that these are crowdfunded. So again, I appreciate any support that you can provide so we can continue to bring these webinars to you. And so as we wrap up here, I want to remind everybody that the webinar is recorded. It's at the same URL as the live event. And Ron's going to send, or I'll send all the slides, a link to the original video, and maybe a few answers that we didn't quite finish up too well, if Ron will help me get those out to you. If you're interested in these, check out our Facebook groups where we really work on better beer judging and better skills and meads. And Ron, as we wrap up, do you have a closing comments on, miles that aren't mild, if I can say that?
Well, I think the thing that's fun about mild is that it's been all sorts of things. So you can have beers of completely different characters that you could still call mild, or have been called mild at various periods in the past. And I think that makes it fun. It's not one thing. It's not something that's been fixed. It's had a trajectory through its existence, and one that's probably continuing to progress, as I think the way people are brewing mild now tends to not be so much based around the brewing sugars. So when you do get craft breweries brewing milds, I think they're much more likely to use malts to color them. So a real change in the way that people traditionally brewed mild, but it's still a valid way to do things. So things never stay still. This is the thing I've learned, that beer is in a constant state of flux, and mild's a particularly good example of that.
Well, we have a lot of thank yous going on there in the chat, Ron. I won't try and go through them all, but there's a lot of folks in addition to myself that really appreciate it. And, going back to our porter discussion, I mean, you showed a huge diversion of that style. Is that true of just about every style?
Yeah.
It's that simple?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, you go to stout. It's even worse. I mean, stouts. I always struggle when I'm writing my books with the stout sections, just because there's so many different types of stout and they vary so enormously. So you've got things going from 2% to 11% at some points.
How about Baltic porters? I've always heard those are fairly consistent.
Yeah, well, they're stouts, but well, I mean, it's the classic Carlsberg one was a beer called DBS, Double Brown Stout, which was based on a William Younger recipe originally. So that's always something else. It's a pity Scottish and Newcastle aren't still going, because it would have been good to get them to brew, because I've got ones from both breweries, the same beer. So in fact, I've got examples that Carl Jacobsen brewed when he was in Edinburgh, and ones he brewed when he got back. So ones that were officially William Younger's DBS and ones that were officially Carlsberg DBS. So it'd be nice to get those brewed in parallel sometimes. That'd be fun.
Well, we'll have to pick another subject. So for those of you, you might tap in there. I know you've done one on, because I caught a little bit of it, HomebrewCon, your Macbeth presentation on Scotch ales.
All right. Yeah. Well, that's always fun. Well, we're talking about things that have changed a lot. Scottish beer's changed a huge amount as well. So I think people are often surprised about Scottish beer, what it's been in the past and where it's gone, and all the funny things it's been.
Well, this was awesome, Ron. I know we could keep talking forever, but I know it's late in your evening, and I'm getting hungry for mine. And so again, thanks to everybody. We really appreciate you joining us. Have a great evening. Ron, thank you so much. And
my pleasure.
Good night. Everybody have a great day. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone. Bye.